I watched my 8-year-old daughter's face crumble as my mother handed her an empty stocking and said, "Maybe next year you'll be good enough for Santa to remember you." What my mother didn't know was that I had spent 3 years secretly filling that stocking myself, and this year I had an army of helpers ready to show her what real Christmas magic looked like. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Victoria Chen, and I should have seen this moment coming from the first Christmas after my divorce 3 years ago. Standing in my childhood living room in Millbrook Heights, watching my mother Patricia deliberately humiliate my daughter Emma in front of the entire extended family, I felt something inside me snap like a frozen branch under too much weight. The living room fell silent, except for the sound of Emma's quiet sniffling as she stared at the empty red velvet stocking that bore her name in glittery gold letters, the same stocking I had been secretly filling for years while my mother took credit for Santa's generosity to my cousin's children. Emma's small fingers traced the fabric of the empty stocking, and I could see her trying to understand why Santa had forgotten her while 8-year-old cousin Tyler was already tearing through a pile of expensive electronics and designer clothes. My mother stood behind Emma with that satisfied smile I remembered from my own childhood, the expression she wore whenever she had successfully made her point about someone's unworthiness. The Christmas tree lights cast dancing shadows across the scene, but there was nothing magical about watching my daughter learn that even Santa could reject her if she wasn't good enough by grandmother's impossible standards. I had built something meaningful over the past 5 years since my messy divorce from Emma's father. After leaving my corporate marketing job to start my own consulting firm, I now employed 12 people who specialized in crisis management and reputation recovery for small businesses throughout Millbrook Heights and the surrounding communities. December was traditionally our slowest month, as most of our clients focused on holiday preparations rather than business strategy. But this year I had been grateful for the lighter workload because it meant I could spend more time with Emma during her winter break from school. Walking into my parents' house that Christmas morning, I had actually felt hopeful about the holiday for the first time since my divorce. My business was thriving beyond anything I had imagined possible when I started it in a spare bedroom with nothing but a laptop and fierce determination to prove I could succeed on my own. I had personally selected and wrapped beautiful gifts for everyone in the family, including an expensive silk scarf for my mother and a leather briefcase for my father that cost more than most people spent on groceries in a month. Most importantly, I had filled Emma's stocking with carefully chosen small gifts and candy, just as I had done secretly for the past 3 years, believing that my mother would continue the charade that Santa had remembered her granddaughter. But something had changed this year, some shift in family dynamics that I hadn't anticipated. My younger brother David had recently remarried, and his new wife Claire brought 2 well-behaved children from her previous marriage who seemed to embody everything my mother valued in grandchildren. They were quiet, obedient, and unfailingly polite, while Emma had inherited my stubborn independence and tendency to ask difficult questions. The contrast had been evident during Thanksgiving dinner when my mother praised David's stepchildren for their perfect manners while pointedly ignoring Emma's attempts to contribute to adult conversation. I should have recognized the warning signs, should have prepared for the possibility that my mother's disapproval of my life choices would eventually extend to punishing my daughter. Throughout my childhood, my mother had used emotional manipulation and conditional love as tools to control behavior, rewarding compliance with affection and punishing independence with cold indifference. I had spent decades learning to navigate her moods and expectations, but I had foolishly believed she would never direct that cruelty toward an innocent child who had already experienced enough instability and rejection in her young life. The divorce had been brutal, with Emma's father choosing his new girlfriend over any meaningful relationship with his daughter. For 3 years, Emma had been dealing with the reality that the most important man in her life had simply walked away when someone more convenient came along. She had been seeing a child therapologist to work through abandonment issues, and we had made significant progress in helping her understand that her father's absence reflected his limitations rather than her worth. But my mother's deliberate cruelty threatened to undo months of healing and reinforce Emma's deepest fears about being unlovable and unworthy of care. Standing in that living room, watching my daughter try to process why Santa had abandoned her while her cousins celebrated their abundance of gifts, I felt a rage so pure and focused that it temporarily overwhelmed my ability to speak. This wasn't about holiday traditions or family expectations. This was about a grown woman deliberately inflicting emotional pain on a vulnerable child to make some twisted point about moral superiority. My mother had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and for the first time in my life I found myself completely unwilling to make excuses for her behavior or minimize the impact of her actions. Emma looked up at me with those enormous brown eyes that had inherited my stubborn spirit, but also my capacity for deep hurt, and I saw her struggling to understand why she didn't deserve the same treatment as her cousin. She had been so excited about Christmas morning, had woken me up at dawn with whispered questions about whether Santa had remembered her wish list, had carefully arranged her slippers next to the fireplace because she had heard that Santa appreciated thoughtful gestures from children. The disappointment on her face was devastating enough, but worse was the resignation I could see creeping in. The premature acceptance that she was somehow different from other children in ways that made her less deserving of love and attention. My father sat in his recliner pretending to read the newspaper, employing his usual strategy of emotional avoidance whenever my mother's behavior became too uncomfortable to witness direct. My brother David and his wife Claire were helping their children organize their gifts, studiously avoiding eye contact with me as if acknowledging what had just happened might somehow make them complicit in the cruelty. The other family members who had gathered for Christmas morning had suddenly found urgent reasons to focus on their coffee cups or examine the Christmas tree ornaments, leaving Emma and me isolated in our humiliation. The silence stretched on until I realized that everyone was waiting for my response, curious to see whether I would challenge my mother's authority or simply accept her judgment, the way I had been trained to do throughout my childhood. They expected me to smooth things over, to find some diplomatic way to explain away Emma's empty stocking while preserving family harmony and my mother's dignity. They anticipated that I would prioritize keeping the peace over protecting my daughter's feelings, just as I had been conditioned to prioritize everyone else's comfort over my own legitimate needs and boundaries. But 3 years of building a successful business had taught me something crucial about leadership and decision-making under pressure. When someone shows you who they are through their actions, you should believe them rather than making excuses for behavior that contradicts your values. When a situation becomes toxic enough to harm innocent people, intervention becomes a moral imperative rather than an optional response. When the people who claim to love you prove themselves willing to hurt those you care about most, continued loyalty becomes a betrayal of your own principles and responsibility. I knelt down beside Emma and wrapped my arms around her small shoulders, feeling her lean into me with the desperate trust that children reserve for the adults they believe will protect them from a world that often seems cruel and incomprehensible. She smelled like the strawberry shampoo we had used during her bath the night before, mixed with the peppermint chapstick she had applied carefully that morning in preparation for Christmas photo. Her hair was still slightly damp from our early morning excitement, and I could feel her heart beating rapidly against my chest as she processed the magnitude of what had just happened. "It's okay, sweetheart," I whispered into her ear, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes, and sometimes they forget that children's feelings are the most important thing about Christmas. I pulled back to look at her face, brushing away the tears that had started to spill over despite her brave attempts to hold them back. "But I want you to remember something very important. You are loved, you are special, and you deserve all the Christmas magic in the world. And if some people can't see that, then we'll find people who can." The words came out calmly and clearly, but I could feel everyone in the room recognizing the underlying message. This wasn't just comfort for a disappointed child. This was a declaration that I would no longer tolerate my mother's emotional manipulation regardless of the consequences for family relationships or holiday tradition. I was drawing a line in the sand, establishing a boundary that hadn't existed before, and making it clear that Emma's well-being would always take priority over family politics, or my mother's need to maintain control through conditional love. My mother's face flushed red as she realized that her carefully planned lesson in family hierarchy had backfired spectacularly. Instead of teaching Emma to be more grateful and compliant, she had inadvertently revealed her own cruelty to an audience that included several family members who had children of their own. Instead of reinforcing her authority as the family matriarch, She had exposed the petty vindictiveness that drove many of her decisions about who deserved love and attention within our extended family. "Victoria, you're being overly dramatic," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Emma needs to learn that actions have consequences, and perhaps if you had taught her better manners and respect for her elders, Santa wouldn't have been so disappointed in her behavior this year." The words were designed to shift blame back onto me and Emma, to make us responsible for the situation rather than holding my mother accountable for her deliberate cruelty. But I had spent 3 years learning to recognize manipulation tactics through my work with clients who were dealing with reputation crises, and I could see exactly what my mother was trying to accomplish. She was attempting to reframe her emotional abuse as justified discipline, to make her victims responsible for provoking her bad behavior rather than acknowledging her choice to inflict pain on a vulnerable child. It was a classic deflection strategy, designed to maintain her position of authority while avoiding any meaningful consequences for her actions. "Mom," I said, standing up and keeping my voice steady despite the fury that was building inside me. "Emma is 8 years old. She spent 3 weeks making you a Christmas card by hand. She helped me bake cookies for everyone in the family, and she's been nothing but excited and respectful about this gathering. If you think an 8-year-old child deserves to be humiliated on Christmas morning, then we have very different ideas about what constitutes appropriate adult behavior." The confrontation that followed revealed fault lines in our family structure that had been developing for years, but had never been openly acknowledged. David tried to play peacemaker, suggesting that everyone was getting too emotional about what was obviously just a misunderstanding about gift distribution. Claire remained diplomatically silent, but I could see her mentally calculating how this drama might affect her own children's relationship with their new grandmother. My father retreated further behind his newspaper, unwilling to challenge his wife but also uncomfortable with defending her treatment of his granddaughter. The other family members began finding excuses to leave earlier than planned, gathering their gifts and making vague promises about getting together again soon. The careful choreography of family Christmas was disintegrating around us, but for the first time in my adult life, I didn't feel responsible for fixing the dysfunction or managing everyone else's emotional reactions to my mother's behavior. Instead, I felt a crystalline clarity about what needed to happen next. Emma and I left my parents' house within the hour, but not before I had made some phone calls that would change everything. As we walked to our car, Emma asked quietly whether we would still have Christmas since Santa had apparently forgotten about her. I knelt down beside our car and looked directly into her eyes, seeing the same determination that had carried me through law school, through a difficult divorce, and through the challenges of building. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Building a business from nothing. "Emma," I said, "we're going to have the most amazing Christmas ever. But we're not going to wait for someone else to make it special for us. We're going to make it special ourselves, with the help of some very good friends who understand what Christmas is really supposed to be about." The confusion on her face began to clear as she processed what I was saying, and I saw the first glimmer of excitement returning to her expression. During the 20-minute drive home to our townhouse, I explained to Emma that sometimes adults make terrible mistakes, and that when they do, other adults have to step in to make things right. I told her about the people I worked with, the 12 incredible individuals who had become like family to me over the past 5 years, and how they had always treated her with kindness and respect whenever she visited my office. I explained that real Christmas magic didn't depend on any one person's approval or disapproval, but came from people choosing to care for each other and create joy together. By the time we pulled into our driveway, Emma was asking detailed questions about my plan and offering suggestions for how we could make Christmas special for other children who might be feeling forgotten or overlooked. The resilience she was showing amazed me, but it also reminded me that children are often more capable of understanding justice and fairness than the adults who claim to be teaching them life lessons. Emma instinctively recognized that what had happened at my parents' house was wrong, and she was eager to be part of creating something better, rather than simply accepting cruelty as an inevitable part of family relationships. That afternoon, while Emma napped off the emotional exhaustion of the morning's events, I began making the phone calls that would transform not only our Christmas, but our understanding of what family could look like when it was based on choice rather than obligation. The first call was to Maria Santos, my office manager and the person I trusted most in the world outside of Emma herself. The second was to my assistant Rachel Kim, who had been with my company since its second year and understood my values better than most family members ever had. What happened over the next few hours reminded me why I had been able to build a successful business despite starting over at 35 with a young child and no financial safety net. The people I had surrounded myself with professionally weren't just employees, they were individuals who shared my commitment to integrity, compassion, and excellence. They had seen me at my best and worst, had supported me through the challenges of single parenthood and entrepreneurship, and had never once questioned my worth or suggested that my life choices were somehow inadequate or misguided. When I explained what had happened that morning and outlined the idea that was forming in my mind, their response was immediate and enthusiastic. Within hours, we had developed a comprehensive plan that would demonstrate to Emma and our entire community what real Christmas generosity looked like when it was motivated by love rather than power, by inclusion rather than exclusion, by genuine care rather than conditional approval. The transformation that began with my mother's cruelty toward Emma would ultimately extend far beyond our personal family drama. It would involve my entire professional team, impact dozens of families throughout Millbrook Heights, and establish new traditions that reflected our values, rather than perpetuating dysfunction that had been passed down through generations. Most importantly, it would show Emma that she was surrounded by people who valued her exactly as she was, without requiring her to earn their love or prove her worthiness through perfect behavior. My mother thought she was teaching Emma a lesson about respect and consequences, but instead she had inadvertently triggered a revolution that would redefine what Christmas meant for everyone involved. The empty stocking that was supposed to symbolize Emma's inadequacy would become the catalyst for creating abundance beyond anything my mother's materialistic version of holiday magic could provide. The silence in that bathroom stretched on as I stared at my reflection, but my mind was racing through memories I had tried so hard to bury. My hands gripped the marble countertop as I remembered my 25th birthday, when I had excitedly called my parents to share news about landing my first major client as a freelancer. The conversation lasted exactly 3 minutes before my mother cut me off to tell me about Amanda's latest ultrasound appointment. She was pregnant with Lily then, and every conversation in our family seemed to revolve around the upcoming arrival of their first grandchild. I had been struggling to make ends meet, working from a cramped studio apartment, and eating ramen noodles for dinner most nights, but all my mother wanted to discuss was nursery colors and baby shower plans. I splashed more cold water on my face, trying to wash away the sting of tears that threatened to spill over. The guest bathroom in my childhood home felt smaller than I remembered, with its faded floral wallpaper and the same hand towels my mother had used for the past 15 years. Everything about this house represented a version of myself I had worked so hard to outgrow, yet here I was, reduced to hiding in the bathroom like a wounded child. The worst part wasn't even the cruelty of my mother's words, though those cut deep enough. The worst part was the casual way she had delivered them, as if calling her own daughter a disappointment was as natural as commenting on the weather. Walking back toward the living room, I could hear my family's voices picking up where they had left off, as if nothing had happened. Amanda was explaining to the children how Santa's elves worked all year long to make special toys for good little boys and girls. My father was chuckling at something Connor had said about wanting to visit the North Pole. The normalcy of their conversation after what had just transpired felt surreal, like I was living in some twisted alternate reality where emotional cruelty was perfectly acceptable as long as it was followed by holiday cheer. I paused in the hallway, looking at the wall of family photos my mother had carefully curated over the years. There I was at various ages, but always somehow positioned at the edge of the frame, always slightly separated from the central cluster of faces. In my high school graduation photo, I stood alone while my parents flanked Amanda, who was only a sophomore but somehow commanded the center of attention. In family vacation pictures, I was consistently the one taking the photo rather than being in it, the designated photographer who documented everyone else's happiness. Even in recent photos from last year's Christmas, I noticed how I seemed to fade into the background while Amanda's family took center stage. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't new behavior from my parents. This was a pattern that had been establishing itself for decades, so gradually that I had never noticed the systematic way they had been conditioning me to accept less, to expect less, to be grateful for whatever scraps of attention they threw my way. I had been so focused on building my business and proving my worth through financial success that I had failed to see the fundamental truth. To my parents, I would always be the consolation prize, the backup plan, the daughter who served a purpose as long as that purpose didn't interfere with their real priorities. Returning to the living room, I settled back into my chair and watched my family continue their Christmas morning ritual. Lily was carefully arranging her new dolls in elaborate scenarios, while Connor zoomed his action figures around the coffee table, making elaborate sound effects. Amanda sat on the floor with them, fully engaged in their play, while Dave documented everything with his phone camera. My parents watched from the couch, my mother's face glowing with the kind of maternal pride I had never seen directed toward me, even during my biggest professional accomplishment. I tried to remember the last time my mother had looked at me with that expression of unqualified approval and came up empty. When I graduated summa cum laude from college, she had seemed more concerned about whether I would be able to find a husband with such an intense focus on academics. When I landed my first corporate job, she worried aloud that I was becoming too career-focused and would miss out on the important things in life. When I started my own business, she expressed concern that I was taking unnecessary risks and should consider finding a more stable position with benefits. It seemed that no matter what I accomplished, she could only see what was missing from my life, rather than celebrating what I had achieved. The financial support I had been providing my family over the years suddenly took on a different meaning as I sat there watching them enjoy their Christmas morning. I had convinced myself that my contributions were appreciated, that they represented a way for me to show love and be valuable to my family. But now I wondered if my parents simply saw my financial assistance as something they were entitled to, a natural consequence of my lack of other responsibilities. After all, what else did I have to spend my money on? I didn't have children to support. I didn't have a husband to consider. I didn't have the real obligations that defined a meaningful life in their eyes. The conversation eventually turned to plans for the new year, and I listened as my parents discussed their hopes for Amanda's family. They wanted to help with a down payment on a bigger house. They were planning to contribute to a family vacation to Disney World. They were already talking about setting aside money for the children's extracurricular activities. The assumption seemed to be that these plans would continue to be partially funded by my contributions, though no one bothered to ask if I was willing or able to maintain that level of support. They simply took it for granted that I would continue to play my role as the reliable financial backstop while they focused their emotional investment on the family members who truly mattered. As the morning wore on, I found myself studying the dynamics of our family interactions with the same analytical eye I brought to my business plan. I noticed how my parents asked detailed questions about Connor's preschool experiences, but never inquired about the major contracts I had recently secured. I observed how they offered unsolicited advice about Lily's social development, but showed no interest in the challenges I faced as a small business owner. I watched how they celebrated Amanda's decision to redecorate her kitchen but dismissed my recent office expansion as unnecessary extravagance. The pattern was so consistent it was almost algorithmic. Anything related to Amanda's traditional family life was worthy of attention, support, and celebration. Anything related to my professional achievements or personal independence was either ignored or subtly criticized. I had spent years trying to bridge this gap by demonstrating my value through financial generosity, but I was beginning to understand that no amount of money would ever earn me the kind of respect and affection my parents reserved for their real daughter. When Amanda mentioned that she was considering going back to school to get her teaching certificate, my parents immediately began discussing how they could help with childcare and financial support. The enthusiasm in their voices was unmistakable, and I felt a familiar pang of envy mixed with confusion. When I had decided to leave my corporate job to start my own business, the family response had been concern and discouragement. No one had offered to help with startup costs or provide emotional support during the difficult early months. Instead, I had been lectured about the importance of stability and warned about the risks of entrepreneurship. The double standard was so glaring that I wondered how I had managed to ignore it for so long. Amanda's dreams were worthy of family investment and encouragement. My dreams were reckless gambles that reflected poor judgment and misplaced priority. Amanda's choices were celebrated as evidence of her wisdom and maturity. My choices were questioned as signs of my fundamental inability to understand what really mattered in life. Sitting there in that familiar living room, surrounded by the Christmas decorations I had helped pay for, watching my family celebrate traditions I had helped fund, I felt a strange sense of clarity beginning to emerge from the hurt and confusion. The problem wasn't that I was a disappointment. The problem was that I had been trying to earn approval from people who had already decided I didn't deserve it. I had been playing a rigged game, following rules that were designed to ensure I could never win. My mother's comment about Santa not visiting disappointments wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or a reaction to holiday stress. It was the crystallization of an attitude that had been shaping our family dynamics for years. In her mind, I was living proof that professional success without traditional family milestones was ultimately hollow and meaningless. My achievements were interesting but irrelevant. My contributions were useful but expected. My presence was tolerated but not particularly valued. The realization should have been devastating, but instead it felt almost liberating. For the first time in years, I could see the situation clearly, without the fog of hope and denial that had been clouding my perception. I didn't need to keep trying to prove my worth to people who had already made up their minds about my value. I didn't need to continue funding their dreams while my own accomplishments were dismissed. I didn't need to accept their definition of what constituted a meaningful life. As I prepared to leave my parents' house that afternoon, I felt something fundamental shifting inside me. The hurt was still there, sharp and immediate, but it was accompanied by a growing sense of resolve. I had built something meaningful over the past 5 years, something that extended far beyond my family's narrow definition of success. I had created jobs for 15 people. I had helped countless clients celebrate their most important moments. I had contributed to my community in ways that my parents couldn't even begin to understand. More importantly, I had surrounded myself with people who valued my contributions and respected my choices. My staff didn't see me as a disappointment or a cautionary tale. They saw me as a leader, a mentor, someone worth following and support. My clients didn't question my life choices or suggest that my success was somehow incomplete. They trusted me with their most important celebrations and relied on my expertise to make their dreams come reality. The drive home gave me time to process everything that had happened and everything I had realized. My apartment felt like a sanctuary after the emotional minefield of my childhood home, and I spent the evening sitting by my own Christmas tree, drinking wine and thinking about what came next. The hurt would take time to heal, but the clarity was immediate and energizing. I knew exactly what I needed to do, and for the first time in years I felt excited about the possibilities ahead of me. That night I pulled out my laptop and began making notes, not about my family or my feelings, but about my business and my staff and the community I had been building without even realizing it. I thought about Maria, who had worked late every night in December to ensure our clients' events were perfect. I thought about Brandon, who had donated his time to help local nonprofits with their marketing even though we weren't being paid for the work. I thought about Sophie, who had spent her own money on emergency supplies when a vendor let us down at the last minute. These people understood the true meaning of generosity and loyalty. They knew what it meant to support each other and work toward common goals. They had shown me more genuine care and respect in 5 years than my family had offered in 32. The family I had been born into might not appreciate me, but the family I had chosen absolutely did. As I sat there in my apartment, surrounded by the evidence of my success and independence, I realized that my mother had been wrong about more than just my worthiness for Santa's attention. She had been wrong about what constituted a meaningful life, wrong about the value of professional achievement, wrong about the importance of traditional milestones. Most importantly, she had been wrong about my ability to create my own version of happiness and fulfillment. The plan that began forming in my mind that night wasn't about revenge or retaliation. It was about redirection and reclamation. I had been pouring my resources and energy into relationships that didn't value what I had to offer. It was time to redirect those resources toward people and causes that would appreciate and amplify my contributions. I had been trying to fit into a family structure that had no real place for me. It was time to focus on the family I had chosen and the community I had built. Christmas Day had ended very differently than it had begun, but not in the way I had expected. I had started the day hoping for acceptance and ended it with something far more valuable: the absolute clarity that comes from finally understanding your situation completely. My parents had given me a gift after all, though not the one they intended. They had freed me from the exhausting cycle of seeking their approval and opened my eyes to all the approval and appreciation I had already earned from people who actually mattered. The morning after Christmas dawned gray and cold, matching the numbness I felt as I sat at my kitchen island with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. My apartment felt different somehow, like I was seeing it through new eyes. The modern furniture I had carefully selected, the artwork I had commissioned from local artists, the view of Cedar River that I paid premium rent to enjoy, all of it represented choices I had made independently, without seeking anyone's approval or permission. For the first time, I appreciated the space not as a consolation prize for being unmarried, but as evidence of my autonomy and success. My phone had been buzzing intermittently since dawn with text messages from Amanda, each one more desperate than the last. The first few were casual attempts to check on me, asking if I had gotten home safely and whether I wanted to meet for coffee later in the week. When I didn't respond immediately, the tone shifted to concern, then to barely concealed anxiety. By the fourth message, she was practically begging me to call her back, insisting that Mom hadn't meant anything by her comment, and that I was overreacting to what was obviously just holiday stress talking. The messages revealed something I had never fully understood about my family dynamic. Amanda wasn't just the favored daughter, she was also the designated peacekeeper, the one responsible for smoothing over any conflicts that threatened the family's carefully maintained facade of harmony. Her increasingly frantic attempts to reach me weren't motivated by genuine concern for my feelings, but by fear that I might disrupt the delicate ecosystem that depended on my quiet compliance and financial support. I set my phone aside without responding and opened my laptop instead. If there was one thing 5 years of entrepreneurship had taught me, it was how to channel emotional energy into strategic planning. The hurt and anger I felt could either consume me or fuel me, and I had spent too many years building something meaningful to let my parents' dysfunction derail my progress now. Instead of wallowing in self-pity or seeking validation from people who had proven themselves incapable of providing it, I would do what I did best: analyze the situation objectively and develop a comprehensive response plan. The first step was conducting a thorough audit of my family relationships, treating them with the same analytical rigor I applied to underperforming business partnership. I pulled up my banking records and began documenting every financial transaction I had made on behalf of my family members over the past 5 years. The numbers were staggering even to me. Between property tax payments, emergency transfers, gift purchases, and event subsidies, I had been contributing nearly $30,000 annually to support my parents' lifestyle and Amanda's family expenses. What made the figures even more shocking was the complete absence of gratitude or acknowledgement I had received in return. Not once had my parents thanked me for covering their property taxes when Dad's retirement investments tanked. Not once had Amanda expressed appreciation for the emergency funds I had transferred to cover unexpected medical bills or car repairs. The money simply disappeared into their lives as if it had materialized from thin air, leaving no trace of my sacrifice or generosity. More disturbing was the pattern of increasing dependence I could trace through the transaction history. What had started as occasional emergency assistance had evolved into a systematic expectation of financial support. My parents had restructured their entire retirement budget around the assumption that I would continue covering major expenses indefinitely. Amanda had taken on additional debt and lifestyle inflation based on the safety net my transfers provided. They had built their financial security on my contributions while simultaneously criticizing the career success that made those contributions possible. The irony was almost laughable. My parents' comfortable retirement lifestyle, the one that allowed them to host elaborate Christmas celebrations and take annual vacations, was entirely dependent on the professional achievements they dismissed as misplaced priority. Amanda's ability to stay home with her children, the choice they praised as evidence of her superior values, was subsidized by the sister they characterized as selfishly career-focused. The traditional family structure they celebrated as morally superior was financially underwritten by the daughter they considered a disappointment. As I continued my analysis, I began to see my family's treatment of me as a sophisticated form of emotional manipulation designed to maintain their access to my resources, while minimizing any obligation to treat me with respect or consideration. By consistently portraying my success as somehow hollow or incomplete, they ensured that I would continue seeking their approval through ever-increasing acts of generosity. By positioning my independence as a character flaw rather than an achievement, they maintained psychological leverage that prevented me from recognizing my own value and establishing appropriate boundaries. The strategy had been remarkably effective for years, largely because I had been too busy building my business and too emotionally invested in family harmony to step back and see the bigger picture. But my mother's Christmas morning comment had shattered the illusion that my contributions were appreciated or that my efforts to earn their respect would ever succeed. In trying to wound me, she had actually liberated me from a cycle of futile attempts to prove my worth to people who had no intention of acknowledging it. My phone rang, interrupting my analysis. The caller ID showed my father's number, and after a moment's hesitation, I decided to answer. His voice was carefully controlled, the tone he used when he was trying to manage a difficult situation without admitting any wrongdoing. He asked if I was feeling better today, as if my reaction to being called a disappointment could be attributed to temporary illness rather than justified hurt. He suggested that perhaps we had all been a bit emotional yesterday, and that it might be best to put the incident behind us and move forward as a family. The conversation was a masterclass in gaslighting, though I doubted my father was conscious of the manipulation techniques he was employing. He never acknowledged that my mother's comment was inappropriate or hurtful. He never admitted that I had legitimate reasons to be upset. Instead, he focused on my reaction, framing my hurt feelings as an over-response that was somehow damaging to family unity. The implicit message was clear: I was responsible for managing my own emotions and protecting everyone else from the consequences of their cruelty. I listened to his entire speech without interrupting, taking mental notes on the techniques he used to deflect responsibility and minimize the impact of what had happened. When he finished, I thanked him politely for calling, and told him I needed some time to process everything that had occurred. He seemed satisfied with this response, apparently interpreting my calm tone as evidence that his damage control efforts had been successful. He had no way of knowing that my composure wasn't a sign of forgiveness but of strategic plan. After ending the call, I turned my attention to the second phase of my analysis, evaluating the resources and relationships I could leverage to create a meaningful response to my family's treatment. Unlike my parents, who seemed to view relationships as zero-sum competitions for loyalty and attention, I had spent years building a network of mutual support and genuine appreciation. My staff wasn't just a collection of employees, they were a community of people who had chosen to invest their careers in the vision I had created. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that my real family wasn't the one I had been born into, but the one I had assembled through shared values and common goals. Maria had been with me since the company's second year, and she knew my business better than I knew it myself. She had worked countless late nights and weekends, not because I demanded it, but because she believed in what we were building together. Brandon had turned down offers from larger companies because he valued the creative freedom and collaborative environment we had established. Sophie had invested her own money in professional development courses that would benefit our clients, without any guarantee of reimbursement. These people had seen me at my best and worst, had supported me through the challenges of building a business from nothing, and had celebrated my successes without qualification or reservation. They knew the real Jessica Mitchell, not the caricature my parents had constructed to justify their treatment of me. They valued my leadership, respected my expertise, and appreciated my contributions to their professional and personal growth. The contrast with my family relationships was stark and illuminating. While my parents viewed my success with suspicion and resentment, my staff saw it as evidence of the principles and work ethic they wanted to emulate. While my family treated my financial contributions as entitlements to be taken for granted, my employees understood that our mutual prosperity required mutual respect and effort. While my parents criticized my life choices as evidence of misplaced priorities, the people who worked with me every day saw those same choices as proof of my commitment to building something meaningful and sustainable. As I considered how to respond to my family's treatment, I knew that any action I took had to align with the values I had established in my professional life. I couldn't allow hurt feelings to drive me toward petty revenge, or destructive behavior that would compromise my integrity or damage my reputation. Instead, I needed to develop a response that would be strategic, principled, and ultimately constructive for everyone involved. The solution began to crystallize as I thought about the fundamental mismatch between my family's expectations and their behavior. They wanted the benefits of my success without acknowledging its value. They demanded my financial support while dismissing the career that made that support possible. They expected my continued participation in family events and traditions, while treating me as a second-class member whose feelings and perspectives didn't matter. What if I simply stopped enabling this dysfunction? What if I redirected my resources toward people and causes that would appreciate them? What if I used my organizational skills and business network to create the kind of Christmas magic my mother claimed I didn't understand, but did it for people who would actually value the gesture? The idea was simultaneously simple and revolutionary. Instead of continuing to subsidize my family's lifestyle while accepting their disrespect, I would withdraw my financial support and invest those resources in something that aligned with my value. Instead of trying to earn appreciation from people who had proven themselves incapable of providing it, I would focus my energy on relationships that were already based on mutual respect and genuine affection. The plan that began forming in my mind wasn't motivated by spite or revenge, though I had to admit, there was a certain poetic justice to the idea of my parents discovering exactly how much their disappointment had been contributing to their comfortable lives. More importantly, it was an opportunity to demonstrate the very qualities my mother claimed I lacked: generosity, community spirit, and understanding of what truly mattered during the holiday season. I spent the rest of the morning researching charitable organizations in Cedar Falls, looking for groups that were working with families who were struggling financially during the holiday. I identified several that were providing Christmas assistance to children whose parents couldn't afford gifts, and others that were organizing holiday meals for elderly residents who would otherwise spend the season alone. These were people who understood the value of generosity because they had experienced real need, not manufactured drama designed to manipulate family members into providing financial support. By afternoon, I had developed the framework for what I was already thinking of as my Christmas redemption project. The money I had been spending annually to support my family's lifestyle could instead fund a comprehensive holiday assistance program that would make a genuine difference in the lives of people who truly needed help. The organizational skills I had developed through my business could coordinate an effort that would demonstrate real Christmas spirit, not the shallow materialism my parents seemed to mistake for holiday magic. More importantly, I could involve my staff in the project, giving them an opportunity to use their professional skills for a cause that would benefit the entire community. This wasn't just about redirecting my financial resources, it was about redirecting my emotional and creative energy toward relationships and activities that aligned with my values and would generate the kind of genuine satisfaction that comes from meaningful work. The phone rang again as I was finalizing my preliminary plans. This time it was Amanda, and her voice was strained with barely controlled panic. She had been calling and texting all day, she said, and she was worried about me. She wanted to know if I was planning to come to New Year's Eve dinner at Mom and Dad's house, and whether I needed to talk about what had happened yesterday. She kept insisting that family was family, that we needed to stick together, that Mom was just going through a difficult time and didn't mean what she said. The conversation revealed the extent to which Amanda had internalized our family's dysfunction and accepted her role as the emotional caretaker responsible for managing everyone else's feelings and maintaining artificial harmony. She genuinely seemed to believe that the problem wasn't our mother's cruelty but my failure to quickly forgive and forget. The idea that I might have legitimate grievances or that our parents' behavior was inappropriate never seemed to cross her mind. When I explained that I needed some space to think about my relationship with the family and that I wouldn't be attending New Year's Eve dinner, Amanda's panic became even more evident. She started talking about how much our parents loved me, how important family traditions were, how devastating it would be for everyone if I wasn't there to celebrate the new year together. What she didn't say, but what came through clearly in her tone, was her fear that my absence would force her to confront the dysfunctional dynamic she had been working so hard to ignore. I ended the conversation as gently as possible, promising to stay in touch but making it clear that I wouldn't be returning to family gatherings until some fundamental issues were addressed. Amanda seemed to interpret this as a negotiating position rather than a firm boundary, asking what it would take to make things right and whether there was anything she could do to help resolve the situation. I told her the truth: this wasn't something she could fix, because she wasn't the one who had created the problem. As evening approached, I felt a sense of clarity and purpose I hadn't experienced in months. The hurt from my mother's comment was still there, but it was no longer the dominant emotion driving my thoughts and decisions. Instead, I felt energized by the possibilities ahead of me and excited about the opportunity to channel my resources and skills toward something genuinely meaningful. The family I had been born into might not appreciate me, but I was about to remind myself and my community exactly what I was capable of when I stopped wasting energy on relationships that couldn't be fixed and started focusing on connections that were already strong. My mother thought Santa didn't visit disappointments, but she was about to discover what real Christmas magic looked like when it was created by someone who understood the difference between genuine generosity and emotional manipulation. That night, I called Maria and asked if she would be willing to meet with me the next morning to discuss a special project I had in mind. Her immediate enthusiasm and willingness to help, even during her holiday break, reminded me once again of the vast difference between the family I had chosen and the one I had been trying so desperately to please. The people who truly cared about me didn't need to be convinced of my worth or manipulated into showing appreciation. They simply valued what I brought to their lives and were eager to support whatever vision I wanted to pursue. The transformation that had begun with my mother's cruel comment was about to enter its next phase, and I could hardly wait to see what we could accomplish together. Maria arrived at my apartment the next morning carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee and wearing the same expression of focused determination I had seen countless times during our biggest client presentation. She settled into my kitchen chair and waited patiently while I explained everything that had happened on Christmas morning, along with the plan that had been taking shape in my mind ever since. As I spoke, I watched her face cycle through surprise, anger, and finally a fierce protective loyalty that reminded me why she had become so much more than just my office manager over the years. When I finished outlining my vision for redirecting my family's financial support toward families who genuinely needed Christmas assistance, Maria was quiet for a long moment. Then she pulled out her phone and began scrolling through her contacts. "I know exactly where to start," she said, her voice filled with quiet excitement. "My neighbor runs the volunteer program at Cedar Falls Elementary. She's been telling me about kids who won't have any Christmas presents this year because their parents are choosing between gifts and rent payment. And my church has been organizing meal deliveries for seniors who can't afford groceries, let alone holiday dinners." The enthusiasm in her voice was infectious, and I felt the first genuine spark of joy I had experienced since Christmas morning. This was what real partnership felt like, when someone understood your vision and immediately began building on it rather than questioning whether it was worth pursuing. Within an hour, we had identified 12 families with children who would benefit from Christmas assistance, along with 8 elderly residents who would welcome both holiday meals and companionship during what was often the loneliest time of year for people living alone. By the time Brandon arrived at my apartment that afternoon, Maria and I had developed a comprehensive action plan that would have impressed our most demanding corporate client. We had researched age-appropriate gifts for 15 children ranging from toddlers to teenagers, calculated the costs for complete holiday meal packages including all the traditional fixings, and identified local vendors who could help us execute everything within a compressed timeline. The total budget was almost exactly what I had been spending annually to support my parents' and sisters' lifestyle, but the impact would be immeasurably great. Brandon listened to our presentation with the same intense focus he brought to our most challenging marketing campaigns, occasionally asking clarifying questions or suggesting refinements to our approach. When we finished, he was already opening his laptop and pulling up spreadsheets. "We need to coordinate this like a military operation," he said, his fingers flying across the keyboard. "If we're going to pull this off before New Year's, every detail has to be perfect. But I think we can create something really special here, something that will make a genuine difference in people's lives." The transformation in both of them was remarkable to witness. These were people who had spent weeks organizing elaborate corporate holiday parties and high-end wedding receptions, but I could see in their faces that this project meant something entirely different to them. This wasn't about impressing clients or meeting contractual obligations. This was about using their professional skills to create real joy for people who had given up hope of experiencing any holiday magic this year. Over the next few hours, we developed what Brandon dubbed Operation Christmas Miracle, a coordinated effort that would involve our entire staff working together to deliver an unforgettable holiday experience to families who needed it most. Sophie would handle the logistics of gift purchasing and wrapping, drawing on her extensive experience coordinating wedding favor distributions and corporate gift programs. Marcus would manage the financial aspects, ensuring that every dollar was accounted for and that we maximized our impact through strategic vendor negotiations. Rachel would organize the delivery teams, using her event coordination skills to schedule everything with military precision. As word of the project spread to the rest of our staff, the response was overwhelming. Tom immediately volunteered to design custom Christmas cards for each family, along with special certificates explaining that their gifts were part of a community Christmas celebration. Lisa offered to coordinate with local restaurants and catering companies to ensure that our holiday meal packages would rival anything served in the finest dining establishments in Cedar Falls. Jake proposed creating a digital documentation system so we could capture the impact of our efforts and potentially expand the program in future years. What struck me most powerfully was how naturally everyone embraced the project without needing any explanation of my personal motivation. They didn't ask why I was suddenly redirecting resources away from my family or whether this represented some kind of emotional reaction to holiday stress. They simply saw an opportunity to use their skills for something meaningful and immediately began contributing ideas and energy to make it as successful as possible. The contrast with my family's reaction to my professional achievements couldn't have been more stark. While my parents questioned my priorities and dismissed my success as evidence of misplaced values, my chosen family celebrated the opportunity to channel that success toward helping others. While my blood relatives took my contributions for granted and responded with criticism when I tried to establish boundaries, these people appreciated every opportunity to work together toward common goals. We spent the next 3 days executing our plan with the same precision and attention to detail that had built our company's reputation for excellence. Sophie coordinated shopping expeditions that felt more like treasure hunts, as team members searched for the perfect gifts for children they had never met, but whose wish lists we had carefully researched. Marcus negotiated with vendors and suppliers to stretch our budget as far as possible, securing donations and discounts that allowed us to provide even more generous packages than we had originally planned. The transformation in my office was magical to witness. Our usual professional workspace became a Christmas workshop, with gift wrapping stations set up in every available corner and holiday music playing softly in the background. Rachel organized assembly lines for meal preparation, while Tom worked late into the evening creating personalized cards and certificates for each recipient family. The energy was infectious, and I found myself working alongside people who had become my closest friends, creating something beautiful together. On December 30th, we began our delivery. The first stop was the Rodriguez family, where 8-year-old Carlos had been hoping for a bicycle that his single mother couldn't afford on her housekeeping salary. When Maria and I knocked on their apartment door carrying packages and explaining that Carlos had been selected for a special Christmas surprise, his mother began crying before we even finished our introduction. Carlos himself was speechless when he saw the bike we had chosen, a red mountain bike with all the accessories he had mentioned in his letter to Santa. The scene was repeated throughout the day as we visited family after family, delivering not just gifts but genuine hope and joy to people who had assumed this Christmas would be another reminder of everything they couldn't provide for their children. At the Johnson house, 5-year-old Emma squealed with delight when she discovered the art supplies and easel she had been dreaming about. At the Thompson apartment, teenage siblings Marcus and Maya tried to maintain their cool composure when they realized we had brought them the gaming console they had been saving allowance money to buy for months. But the most powerful moments came during our visits to the elderly residents who had been spending the holidays alone. When we arrived at Miss Patterson's small apartment with a complete holiday dinner and an assortment of homemade cookies, she invited us in for tea and spent an hour sharing stories about Christmases from her childhood. When we delivered a care package to Mr. Chen, who had been widowed 6 months earlier, he showed us photographs of holiday celebrations with his late wife and expressed gratitude that someone remembered he was still here.
These interactions reminded me of something I had lost sight of during my years of trying to earn my family's approval: the profound satisfaction that comes from genuine generosity, when giving is motivated by empathy rather than obligation. Every family we visited responded with authentic gratitude and appreciation, not because they felt entitled to our assistance, but because they understood how much thought and care had gone into creating their Christmas surprise. By the time we finished our deliveries on New Year's Eve, word of our project had spread throughout Cedar Falls. The local newspaper wanted to run a feature story about our Christmas assistance program, and several community organizations had reached out to ask whether we would consider coordinating similar efforts for other holidays throughout the year. The recognition was gratifying, but what mattered more was the way the project had deepened the bonds between my staff members and clarified our shared commitment to using our professional success for meaningful purposes. The phone calls from my family had continued throughout the week, each one more desperate than the last. My father had tried reasoning with me, explaining that family relationships required forgiveness and compromise.
Amanda had attempted emotional manipulation, insisting that our parents were devastated by my absence and that I was destroying family unity over a simple misunderstanding. My mother had even called once, though she spent most of the conversation complaining about how my reaction was ruining everyone's holiday season, rather than acknowledging any responsibility for the situation. What surprised me was how little impact these conversations had on my emotional state. The hurt and anger I had felt on Christmas morning had been transformed into something much more powerful: absolute clarity about my values and priorities. My family wanted me to resume my role as the reliable financial support system who never questioned their treatment or demanded genuine respect in return. But I had discovered something far more fulfilling in the relationships I had built with people who appreciated my contributions and shared my vision for what generosity could accomplish. The final delivery of our Christmas project was the most meaningful one. We had saved Miss Williams for last because her situation was the most complex. She was a 78-year-old grandmother who had recently taken custody of her 6-year-old grandson after her daughter's struggles with addiction had made it impossible for her to provide a stable home. Mrs. Williams was living on Social Security and spending most of her income on childcare and school supplies, leaving nothing for Christmas presents or special holiday treats. When we arrived at her small house carrying gifts for little David along with a complete holiday dinner and a basket of homemade cookies, Mrs. Williams broke down completely. She explained that she had been praying for some kind of Christmas miracle, not for herself but for David, who had already experienced so much disappointment and instability in his young life. She had been dreading Christmas morning because she had nothing to give him except her love, which she feared wouldn't be enough to make the holiday special. Watching David's face light up as he discovered the educational toys and books we had selected for him, seeing Miss Williams a relief and gratitude as she realized she would be able to provide her grandson with a memorable Christmas after all. I understood something about holiday magic that my mother's materialistic version had never captured. Real Christmas spirit wasn't about expensive gifts or elaborate celebrations funded by guilt and obligation. It was about using whatever resources you had to create joy for people who needed it most, without expecting anything in return except the satisfaction of knowing you had made a difference. As we prepared to leave Mrs. Williams's house, she pressed a handmade card into my hands. Inside, David had drawn a picture of our entire team gathered around a Christmas tree, with the words "Thank you for being our Christmas angels" written in crayon across the bottom. The drawing was crooked and the spelling was imperfect, but it represented something more valuable than any appreciation I had ever received from my family: genuine gratitude from people who understood the true value of generosity. That night, as my staff and I gathered at my apartment to celebrate the successful completion of our project, I felt a sense of fulfillment and peace that had nothing to do with my family's approval or disapproval. We had used our professional skills and resources to create real magic for people who needed it most, and in doing so we had demonstrated values that were far more meaningful than the shallow materialism my parents mistook for Christmas spirit. The new year began with a different kind of family gathering, as my chosen family of colleagues and friends reflected on what we had accomplished together and began planning how we could expand our community service efforts in the months ahead. We had proven to ourselves and our community that professional success was most meaningful when it was used to lift others up, and that the most satisfying relationships were built on mutual respect and shared values rather than blood ties and financial dependence. My mother had been wrong about Santa not visiting disappointments. The real disappointment was spending years trying to earn approval from people who were incapable of providing it, instead of focusing on relationships with people who appreciated your contributions and supported your dream. The greatest Christmas gift I had ever received was the clarity to see the difference, and the courage to choose the family that truly valued what I had to offer. 6 months later, Mitchell Marketing and Events was recognized by the Cedar Falls Chamber of Commerce for our community service initiatives, and our Christmas assistance program had grown into a year-round effort that partnered with local schools and social services to provide ongoing support for families in need. My relationship with my parents remained complicated, but I had stopped seeking their validation and started focusing on the validation that came from meaningful work and genuine relationships. The business continued to thrive, my staff remained loyal and engaged, and my community impact expanded beyond anything I had imagined possible when I was still trying to buy my family's love with financial support. I learned that sometimes the best gift you can give yourself is the freedom to stop trying to fix relationships that were never meant to work, and start investing in connections that bring out the best in everyone involved. My mother thought I was a disappointment because I hadn't followed her narrow definition of success and fulfillment, but I had built something far more valuable than her approval, a life that reflected my values, relationships that honored my contributions, and a legacy that would continue making a difference long after Christmas morning grudges were forgotten. The real magic wasn't in earning someone else's approval, it was in creating something beautiful with people who shared your vision and appreciated your effort. The emergency team meeting I called for December 26 had never been necessary before in the 5-year history of my consulting firm, but as I watched my 12 employees file into our conference room with coffee cups and concerned expression, I knew this would be the most important presentation I had ever given. Maria arrived first, carrying her usual notepad, and wearing the focused expression that meant she was ready to tackle whatever challenge I was about to present. Rachel followed closely behind, already pulling up spreadsheets on her laptop before she had even settled into her chair. The rest of my team filled in gradually, each person bringing the same energy and attention they brought to our most demanding client crises. These people had become my chosen family over the years, the individuals who had supported me through the challenges of building a business while raising a daughter alone. They had covered for me during Emma's school plays and parent-teacher conferences, had worked late to ensure client deadlines were met when she was sick with childhood illnesses, and had celebrated every milestone in both my professional and personal life with genuine enthusiasm. Unlike my biological family who seemed to view my success with suspicion and resentment, these colleagues had invested themselves in my vision and grown alongside the company we had built together. I began by explaining what had happened at my parents' house the previous morning, watching their faces cycle through shock, anger and fierce protective loyalty as I described the deliberate cruelty my mother had inflicted on Emma. The silence that followed my account was thick with indignation. I could see each team member processing not only the immediate harm that had been done to an innocent child, but also the implications for how they understood my family relationships, and the challenges I had been navigating as a single mother trying to maintain connections with people who clearly didn't value what I had to offer. Maria was the first to speak, her voice tight with barely controlled fury. That woman deliberately traumatized an 8-year-old child to make some twisted point about power and control. Emma doesn't deserve that kind of treatment from anyone, least of all from her own grandmother. The murmur of agreement that rippled through the room confirmed what I already knew about these people. They understood that protecting children was a fundamental moral obligation that transcended family politics or social expectations about maintaining relationships with difficult relatives. Rachel leaned forward in her chair, her laptop already open to a fresh spreadsheet. "What do you need from us, Victoria? Whatever you're planning, we're in. Emma is part of our work family and nobody hurts our family without consequence." The immediate offer of support without any questions about logistics or personal cost reminded me once again why I had been able to build something meaningful with these individuals. They didn't view challenges as inconveniences or opportunities to demonstrate their own moral superiority. They saw problems that needed solutions and immediately began figuring out how to contribute to positive outcomes. The plan I outlined over the next hour was ambitious enough to rival any crisis management campaign we had ever coordinated for our most demanding clients. Using the financial resources I had been spending annually to support my parents' lifestyle and my mother's elaborate holiday celebration, we would create a comprehensive Christmas assistance program that would demonstrate what real generosity looked like when it was motivated by genuine compassion rather than obligation or guilt. The scope would be unprecedented for our small firm, but the impact would extend far beyond our immediate community. Tom Martinez, our communications specialist, was already taking notes and sketching preliminary outlines for media coordination. "We need to document everything properly," he said, his voice filled with quiet excitement. "Not for publicity purposes, but to create a model that other businesses and organizations can replicate. If we're going to do this, we should do it in a way that inspires others to create similar programs in their own community." The strategic thinking he was demonstrating exemplified the kind of long-term vision that had made our company successful, and I felt a surge of pride in the caliber of people I had attracted to our team. Sarah Kim, who handled our financial coordination and vendor relationships, was already pulling up contact lists on her phone. "I know exactly where to start," she said, scrolling through her extensive network of local business connections. "The Millbrook Heights Food Bank has been overwhelmed this month, and the Salvation Army has a waiting list of families who won't receive any Christmas assistance because their resources are stretched too thin. We can coordinate with both organizations to ensure we're reaching the families who need help most, without duplicating efforts that are already underway." The transformation in the room was remarkable to witness. Within minutes, my team had shifted from employees attending an emergency meeting to passionate advocates planning a community intervention that would touch dozens of lives. Jake Thompson, our technology coordinator, was already designing a logistics system that would track gift purchases and delivery schedules with military precision. Lisa Chen, who managed our client relationships, was brainstorming ways to involve our business network in expanding the scope of our assistance program. David Rodriguez, our newest team member, was researching local suppliers who might be willing to provide materials and services at cost. As the planning session continued, I found myself thinking about the contrast between this response and the reaction I would have received if I had tried to organize a similar project through my family connection. My parents would have questioned the wisdom of spending so much money on strangers instead of supporting relatives who needed financial assistance. My brother would have worried about the tax implications and suggested that charity should begin at home. My extended family would have expressed concern that I was taking on too much responsibility and neglecting my primary obligations to blood relatives who had supported me throughout my life. But these individuals saw an opportunity to use our professional skills and resources to create meaningful change in our community, and they embraced the challenge with the same dedication they brought to every project we undertook together. They didn't question my motivations or suggest that my emotional response to my mother's cruelty was clouding my judgment. They simply recognized that we had the capability to make a significant difference in people's lives, and they immediately began figuring out how to maximize our impact through strategic planning and coordinated execution. Emma wandered into the conference room around lunchtime, still wearing the Christmas pajamas she had put on that morning with such excitement 24 hours early. The sight of my entire team gathered around our conference table with laptops and planning documents sparked her curiosity, and she climbed into the chair next to mine to listen as we discussed logistics for gift purchasing and meal coordination. The way my colleagues automatically included her in their conversations, asking for her input on age-appropriate gifts, and explaining our timeline in terms she could understand, reminded me once again of the fundamental difference between chosen family and biological family. These people valued Emma's perspective and treated her as an important member of our extended community, not as an inconvenience or obligation to be managed. When she suggested that we include art supplies in our gift packages because drawing had helped her feel better during difficult times, Rachel immediately added art materials to our shopping list and asked Emma to help select colors and brands that would appeal to different age groups. When she wondered whether elderly people might feel lonely during the holidays, Maria began researching senior centers and assisted living facilities where we could coordinate visits and meal delivery. The afternoon was spent in detailed operational planning that utilized every skill set represented on our team. Sarah coordinated with local vendors to secure bulk pricing on gift items and food packages, negotiating discounts that would allow us to serve twice as many families as our original budget had projected. Tom developed a communication strategy that would protect the privacy of recipient families while documenting our efforts for potential replication by other organizations. Jake created digital systems for tracking purchases, deliveries, and follow-up communications that would ensure nothing fell through the cracks, despite our compressed timeline. As evening approached, we had transformed our conference room into a command center that rivaled anything we had created for our most complex corporate clients. Whiteboards covered every available wall space, displaying family lists, gift inventories, delivery routes, and volunteer assignments. Laptops were stationed at every workstation, connected to shared databases that would allow real-time coordination between team members working on different aspects of the project. The energy in the room was infectious, and I could see that everyone was energized by the opportunity to apply their professional expertise to something that aligned so perfectly with their personal value. The first deliveries began on December 27th, and the response from recipient families exceeded even our most optimistic projections. The Martinez family, where 6-year-old Sophia had been hoping for a bicycle that her single father couldn't afford on his construction salary, invited us in for hot chocolate when we arrived with not only the bike she had requested but also a helmet, safety gear, and a gift card for bicycle maintenance at the local bike shop. Sophia's squeals of delight as she tested her new bike in the apartment hallway brought tears to the eyes of every team member who witnessed the scene. At the Johnson household, where grandmother Betty had been caring for 3 grandchildren after their parents were killed in a car accident 6 months earlier, our arrival with gifts and a complete holiday dinner prompted an invitation to stay for an impromptu celebration that included homemade cookies and stories about Christmas traditions from Betty's childhood. The children, who had been dealing with grief and financial uncertainty since their parents' death, responded to our visit with a combination of gratitude and renewed hope that reminded everyone on our team why we had chosen to work in crisis management and reputation recovery. The Wilson family presented a more complex situation, as 14-year-old Marcus had been assuming adult responsibilities for his younger siblings, while their mother worked double shifts to keep up with rent payments after losing her previous job due to company downsizing. When we arrived with gifts for all 4 children and grocery cards that would cover several weeks of meals, Marcus initially refused our assistance, explaining that his family didn't accept charity and that they would figure out how to manage their situation independently. It took patient conversation and careful explanation that our assistance was part of a community celebration rather than a judgment about their circumstances, before he would allow us to leave the packages we had prepared. The interaction with Marcus reminded me of the defensive pride I had often felt when well-meaning relatives offered unsolicited advice about my life choices, or suggested that I was struggling more than necessary because I had chosen independence over traditional family support. The difference was that our assistance came without conditions, expectations, or implied criticism of the choices that had led to their current circumstances. We were offering resources and support because we believed every child deserved to experience Christmas joy, not because we wanted to demonstrate our own superiority or control how recipient families managed their lives. The elderly residents we visited presented different challenges but equally rewarding interactions. Miss Patterson, who had been spending holidays alone since her husband's death 3 years earlier, invited our entire delivery team in for tea and spent 2 hours sharing photographs and stories about Christmas celebrations from her 60-year marriage. Mr. Chen, who had been struggling with depression since his retirement from the Postal Service, expressed amazement that people he had never met would take time during their own holiday celebrations to ensure he felt remembered and valued. These conversations reminded me that isolation and loneliness were often more devastating than financial hardship, and that the gift of genuine human connection was frequently more valuable than any material assistance we could provide. The time my team spent listening to stories, admiring family photographs, and sharing their own holiday memories created bonds that extended far beyond our immediate Christmas project and established relationships that would continue throughout the year. By December 31st, we had provided Christmas assistance to 47 families and 18 elderly residents throughout Millbrook Heights and the surrounding community. The local newspaper wanted to feature our efforts in a front-page story about community generosity, and several other businesses had reached out to ask whether we would coordinate similar programs for other holidays throughout the year. The recognition was gratifying, but what mattered most was the transformation I could see in Emma's understanding of what Christmas could represent when it was divorced from family politics and materialistic competition. Emma had participated in every delivery where circumstances allowed, helping to carry packages and greeting recipient families with the same enthusiasm she had once reserved for opening her own present. The experience of seeing her own disappointment, transformed into opportunities to create joy for other children, had taught her lessons about resilience and generosity that no amount of expensive gifts could have provided. More importantly, she had witnessed firsthand that family could be defined by shared values and mutual support rather than blood relationships and geographical proximity. The final delivery was the most meaningful one for both Emma and me. We had saved the Rodriguez family for last because their situation most closely paralleled our own experience with family disappointment and rejection. 8-year-old Carlos had been excluded from his extended family's Christmas celebrations because his parents' divorce had created complicated loyalties and uncomfortable dynamics that older relatives preferred to avoid rather than navigate. When we arrived at their small apartment with gifts for Carlos and a complete holiday meal for the family, his mother Maria began crying before we had even finished explaining our purpose. Carlos himself was initially suspicious of our motives, asking pointed questions about whether the gifts came with conditions or expectations that would later be used against him if his behavior didn't meet adult standards. The wariness in his voice reminded me of Emma's own protective mechanisms, and I realized that children who had experienced adult disappointment often develop sophisticated strategies for guarding against future betrayal. It took patient conversation and Emma's enthusiastic explanation of our project before Carlos would allow himself to believe that someone had chosen to prioritize his happiness without requiring anything in return. Watching Carlos and Emma play with the new art supplies we had brought while their mothers shared stories about the challenges of single parenthood, I understood something about healing that I had never fully grasped before. The best response to cruelty wasn't revenge or retaliation, but the creation of alternative experiences that demonstrated what love and support actually looked like when they were offered freely rather than conditionally. Emma's disappointment at my mother's house had been transformed into empathy for other children facing similar rejection, and that empathy had motivated actions that created genuine joy for dozens of families. As the new year began, my relationship with my parents remained complicated and largely unresolved. They had made several attempts to contact me during the week following Christmas, each conversation characterized by their inability to acknowledge the harm they had caused Emma or accept responsibility for their choice to use a child's emotions as a weapon in their ongoing campaign to control my behavior through guilt and manipulation. I had established clear boundaries about future contact and made it explicitly clear that Emma's well-being would always take priority over family harmony or traditional relationship expectations. But the distance from my biological family had been more than compensated by the strengthening of bonds with my chosen family of colleagues and friends. Our Christmas project had deepened the relationships between team members and clarified our shared commitment to using professional success for meaningful community impact. We had proven to ourselves and our community that small businesses could create significant positive change when they operated according to values that prioritized human dignity over profit maximization and genuine service over self-promotion. 6 months later, Chen Crisis Management had been recognized by the Millbrook Heights Chamber of Commerce for outstanding community service, and our holiday assistance program had evolved into a year-round initiative that partnered with local schools and social services to provide ongoing support for families facing temporary hardship. Emma had started a children's committee that helped identify age-appropriate gifts and activities for our seasonal programs, and she regularly spoke to other children about the importance of using personal advantages to help people who were facing difficult circumstances. The business continued to thrive as word spread about our community involvement and the values that guided our client relationship. Team members remained enthusiastic and engaged, often suggesting new ways to expand our service initiatives and incorporate community benefit into our standard business practices.
The workplace culture we had established attracted high-quality employees who shared our commitment to excellence and integrity, creating a positive cycle that benefited both our professional success and our personal fulfillment. Most importantly, Emma had learned that disappointment and rejection from some people didn't define her worth or limit her ability to create meaningful relationships with others. She had discovered that real family was characterized by mutual support and genuine care rather than shared genetics and traditional obligations. She had experienced firsthand the satisfaction that comes from using personal resources to help others, and she had developed confidence in her own ability to recognize and challenge unfair treatment when she encountered it in the future. My mother's empty stocking had been intended to teach Emma a lesson about compliance and gratitude, but instead it had sparked a revolution that transformed our understanding of generosity, family, and community responsibility. The woman who thought she was demonstrating the consequences of inadequate behavior had inadvertently created an opportunity for dozens of families to experience unprecedented kindness and support during their most challenging moments. The real lesson, Emma learned that Christmas wasn't about earning love through perfect behavior or accepting mistreatment from people who claimed family loyalty as justification for cruelty. Instead, she discovered that she was surrounded by people who valued her exactly as she was, who celebrated her curiosity and independence rather than trying to suppress those qualities, and who were committed to creating a world where every child could experience the security and joy that should be every person's birthright regardless of their family's circumstances or personal history. The magic we created that year didn't depend on anyone else's approval or permission, and it couldn't be taken away by people who disagreed with our choices or questioned our priorities. We had built something beautiful together, something that reflected our values and honored our commitment to treating every person with dignity and respect. The empty stocking that was supposed to symbolize Emma's unworthiness had become the catalyst for demonstrating that real Christmas magic happened when people chose to lift each other up rather than tearing each other down. 3 months after our Christmas intervention, I received a phone call that would forever change how I understood the ripple effects of choosing compassion over compliance. The voice on the other end belonged to Sarah Mitchell, a child psychologist at Millbrook Heights Elementary School, and she was calling to discuss something extraordinary that had been happening in her sessions with several students who had been struggling with family-related trauma and abandonment issues. According to Dr. Mitchell, these children had begun referencing a Christmas story about a little girl whose grandmother gave her an empty stocking, but who discovered that real families were built through kindness rather than blood relations. The story, as Dr. Mitchell explained it, had become a powerful therapeutic tool that was helping children process their own experiences with rejection and disappointment from family members who were supposed to provide unconditional love and support. Emma had apparently been sharing our experience during school counseling sessions, not as a victim seeking sympathy, but as someone who had learned valuable lessons about resilience and the importance of surrounding yourself with people who celebrated your authentic self rather than trying to reshape you into someone more convenient or manageable.
What struck me most profoundly about Dr. Mitchell's call was her observation that Emma had developed an unusual level of emotional intelligence and advocacy skills for an 8-year-old child. She was apparently helping other students recognize patterns of emotional manipulation in their own family relationships, while also demonstrating through her own example that disappointing toxic family members was often a sign of healthy boundary setting rather than personal failure. The transformation in Emma's confidence and self-advocacy abilities had been noticed not only by her teachers and counselors, but by other children who were beginning to see her as a source of wisdom and support during their own difficult family situations. Dr. Mitchell requested permission to use our story as a case study in her upcoming presentation at the National Conference on Childhood Resilience, explaining that our experience illustrated several important principles about helping children recover from family trauma while building new support systems based on mutual respect and genuine care. She wanted to highlight how community intervention and chosen family relationships could provide healing opportunities that weren't available through traditional family therapy approaches, particularly in situations where biological family members remained unwilling to acknowledge their harmful behavior or make meaningful changes. The request prompted me to reflect on how dramatically our lives had changed since that devastating Christmas morning, when my mother had deliberately humiliated Emma in front of our entire extended family. What had begun as a crisis management response to protect my daughter from further emotional abuse had evolved into a comprehensive community service model that was now being studied by professionals who worked with traumatized children throughout the region. The cruel lesson my mother had intended to teach about compliance and gratitude had inadvertently sparked an initiative that was helping dozens of families build healthier relationships and stronger support networks. The success of our Christmas assistance program had led to unexpected opportunities that extended far beyond seasonal charity work. Local businesses had begun requesting our consultation services for developing their own community engagement initiative, recognizing that consumers were increasingly choosing to support companies that demonstrated genuine commitment to social responsibility rather than merely pursuing profit maximization. Our expertise in crisis management and reputation recovery had positioned us perfectly to help organizations navigate the complex balance between authentic community service and effective business practices. Maria had taken the lead on developing these new service offerings, working closely with clients who wanted to create meaningful community impact without appearing to exploit social issues for marketing purposes. Her natural ability to identify authentic motivations and develop approaches that aligned with both business goals and community needs had made her an invaluable resource for companies that were serious about incorporating social responsibility into their core operations, rather than treating charitable activities as occasional public relations opportunities. The expansion of our business services had created new employment opportunities that allowed us to hire additional team members who shared our commitment to using professional skills for positive community impact. Rachel had been promoted to Director of Community Partnership, coordinating relationships between our business clients and local nonprofit organizations to ensure that corporate social responsibility initiatives actually addressed genuine community needs, rather than imposing external agendas on organizations that were already doing effective work. Emma had become an integral part of our community service operations, not as a token child representative, but as someone whose insights about childhood experiences of disappointment and resilience provided valuable perspective for designing programs that would truly serve their intended beneficiaries. Her ability to identify which activities would feel patronizing versus empowering to children. Difficult circumstances had helped us refine our approaches to ensure that assistance was offered in ways that preserved dignity and encouraged self-advocacy, rather than creating dependence or reinforcing feelings of helplessness. The quarterly family meetings we had established to evaluate and expand our community programs had become some of the most rewarding professional experiences of my career. Unlike the toxic family gatherings I had endured throughout my childhood, where criticism and conditional approval were used as tools to maintain hierarchical control, these meetings were characterized by genuine collaboration and mutual support toward shared goals that benefited everyone involved while also serving the broader community. Tom had developed a comprehensive documentation system that tracked the long-term outcomes of our assistance programs, creating data that demonstrated measurable improvements in academic performance, family stability, and community engagement among recipient families. The information was proving invaluable for grant applications and partnership development, but more importantly, it was helping us identify which approaches were most effective for different types of family situations and community needs. The research Tom was conducting had attracted attention from regional foundations that were interested in funding replication of our model in other communities throughout the state. The possibility of expanding our impact beyond Millbrook Heights was exciting, but it also required careful consideration of how to maintain the personal relationships and community knowledge that made our programs effective, while scaling up to serve larger populations with diverse needs and circumstances. Sarah had been working with local government officials to explore ways that our business community partnership model could be integrated into existing social services systems without duplicating efforts or creating bureaucratic complications for families who were already navigating multiple support programs. Her background in financial coordination and vendor relationships had proven essential for developing sustainable funding mechanisms that didn't depend entirely on the continued success of my consulting firm or the voluntary participation of other local businesses. The policy discussions, Sarah was facilitating had revealed significant gaps in traditional social services approaches that our model was uniquely positioned to address. Many existing programs were designed around crisis intervention rather than prevention, and most operated according to rigid eligibility requirements that excluded families who were struggling but didn't meet specific income or demographic criteria. Our flexible relationship-based approach was reaching people who fell through the cracks of traditional assistance programs, while also providing support that addressed emotional and social needs, rather than focusing exclusively on material assistance. Jake had been exploring technology solutions that could help other communities implement similar programs, without requiring the extensive personal networks and local knowledge that had been essential for our initial success. His development of user-friendly databases and communication systems was making it possible for organizations in other cities to coordinate volunteer efforts and track community impact, even when they didn't have dedicated staff members with extensive project management experience. The technology tools Jake was creating had attracted interest from national nonprofit organizations that were looking for ways to improve coordination between local chapters and share successful strategies across different geographic regions. The possibility of our small community initiative influencing national approaches to family support and community development was both thrilling and somewhat overwhelming, particularly since we had never intended to become experts in social services policy when we started our Christmas assistance program. Lisa had been developing training materials and presentation resources that could help other business leaders understand how community service initiatives could be integrated into existing operations without compromising professional responsibilities or creating unsustainable financial commitment. Her experience in client relationship management had provided valuable insights about how to communicate the business benefits of community engagement in ways that appealed to practical decision-makers who might be skeptical about social responsibility programs. The workshops Lisa was conducting for regional business associations had generated considerable interest from entrepreneurs and small business owners who wanted to contribute to their communities but weren't sure how to develop effective programs with limited resources and expertise. Her ability to break down complex social issues into manageable action steps was helping other business leaders recognize that meaningful community impact was achievable, even for companies that couldn't afford to hire dedicated social responsibility staff or make large financial contributions to charitable organizations. David had been working with local schools to develop educational programs that taught children about community service, family relationships, and conflict resolution skills that could help them navigate difficult situations in their own lives. His presentations about our Christmas project had become popular with teachers and administrators who were looking for real-world examples that illustrated abstract concepts about empathy, resilience, and social responsibility in ways that elementary school students could understand and apply. The curriculum David was developing included activities that helped children identify healthy versus unhealthy relationship patterns, practice assertive communication skills, and develop strategies for building supportive connections with trusted adults when family relationships were inadequate or harmful. The program was being piloted in 3 elementary schools throughout the district, with preliminary results indicating significant improvements in students' ability to recognize and respond appropriately to bullying, emotional manipulation, and other forms of interpersonal dysfunction. The impact of our community service work had begun extending beyond direct assistance to individual families and was influencing broader conversations about how communities could support child welfare and family stability through coordinated efforts that involved businesses, social services, and faith-based organizations. The collaborative model we had developed was being studied by researchers who were interested in understanding how informal support networks could complement formal social services systems without creating confusion or competition for limited resources. Emma's role in these broader conversations had evolved naturally from her participation in our original Christmas project to her current position as a youth advocate, who spoke regularly at community meetings, school assemblies, and nonprofit organization events. Her ability to articulate complex ideas about family relationships and community responsibility in language that both children and adults could understand had made her a sought-after speaker who was helping other young people develop confidence in their own ability to recognize and challenge unfair treatment. The speaking engagements Emma was accepting had provided opportunities for her to meet other children who had experienced family rejection or abandonment, and these interactions had reinforced her understanding that her own experience was neither unique nor something to be ashamed of. Instead of seeing herself as different or damaged because of her grandmother's cruelty, she had learned to view her experience as valuable preparation for helping others navigate similar challenges while building healthier relationships with people who appreciated their authentic quality. The mentorship relationships Emma was developing with younger children had also provided valuable learning opportunities for our entire team. As we observed how her natural empathy and communication skills could be channeled into structured support programs that served children who were dealing with family trauma or social isolation. Her success as a peer advocate was inspiring us to explore ways that our community service model could incorporate more opportunities for clients to become service providers themselves, creating sustainable support networks that didn't depend entirely on outside intervention. The annual celebration we had established to commemorate our first Christmas assistance project had become a community tradition that brought together all the families we had served along with the volunteers, donors, and community partners who had contributed to our programs throughout the year. The event had grown from a small gathering in our office conference room to a festival that filled the community center gymnasium, with activities and entertainment provided by local artists, musicians, and youth organizations. The most meaningful moment of each annual celebration occurred when Emma presented the Community Service Awards we had established to recognize individuals and organizations that exemplified the values our programs were designed to promote. The recipients were typically people who had overcome personal challenges to help others facing similar situations, and their stories provided powerful examples of how adversity could be transformed into opportunities for positive community impact when people were supported by networks that celebrated resilience rather than requiring perfect compliance with external expectations. The legacy of that devastating Christmas morning when my mother had given Emma an empty stocking continued to unfold in ways that none of us could have anticipated when we first decided to channel our hurt and anger into constructive community action. What had begun as a protective response to emotional abuse had evolved into a comprehensive model for community development that was being replicated throughout the region and studied by researchers who were interested in understanding how informal support networks could address complex social problems through coordinated volunteer effort. The woman who had intended to teach my daughter a lesson about compliance and gratitude had inadvertently sparked a movement that was helping hundreds of families build stronger relationships and develop more effective strategies for navigating life's inevitable challenges and disappointments. Empty stocking that was supposed to symbolize Emma's inadequacy had become a powerful symbol of the transformation that was possible when communities chose to invest in each other's success rather than competing for scarce resources or maintaining hierarchical power structures that benefited only a privileged few. The real magic we had discovered that Christmas wasn't dependent on any individual's approval or disapproval, and it couldn't be diminished by people who disagreed with our choices or questioned our methods. We had built something lasting and meaningful together, something that reflected our deepest values while honoring our commitment to treating every person with dignity and respect regardless of their family background or personal circumstance. The legacy would continue long after Emma had grown up and moved on to create her own version of chosen family, because we had established principles and practices that could be adapted and implemented by anyone who believed that communities had both the opportunity and responsibility to support each other through difficult times, while celebrating successes that benefited everyone involved. 5 years had passed since that Christmas morning when my mother handed Emma an empty stocking, and I was standing in the auditorium of Millbrook Heights Community College, watching my now 13-year-old daughter deliver the keynote address at the Regional Youth Leadership Conference. The girl who had once questioned whether she deserved Santa's attention was now speaking to an audience of 300 teenagers about the power of transforming personal pain into community healing. Her voice carried across the packed auditorium with confidence and clarity as she explained how one moment of cruelty had sparked a movement that had touched thousands of lives throughout our region. Emma's presentation included slides showing the evolution of our community service programs, from that first emergency Christmas intervention to the comprehensive network of support services that now operated year-round across 15 communities. She spoke about the children who had been helped, the families who had discovered new sources of strength, and the businesses that had learned to integrate social responsibility into their core operation. But the most powerful moment came when she shared her personal transformation, from a child who felt unworthy of love, to a young advocate who understood that worthiness was never something that needed to be earned through perfect behavior or compliance with other people's expectations. The standing ovation that followed Emma's presentation lasted nearly 5 minutes, and I watched through tears as dozens of teenagers surrounded her afterward with questions about how they could start similar programs in their own community. Many of them shared their own stories of family disappointment and rejection, finding in Emma's example the validation they needed to believe that their painful experiences could become sources of strength and wisdom rather than permanent wounds that defined their limitations. Dr. Mitchell, who had invited Emma to speak at the conference, found me afterward in the lobby and shared news that our community service model was being featured in her upcoming book about innovative approaches to childhood trauma recovery. According to her research, the programs we had developed demonstrated measurably better outcomes than traditional therapeutic interventions for children who had experienced family rejection or abandonment. The combination of practical assistance, community connection, and peer support was proving more effective than individual counseling alone for helping young people develop resilience and self-advocacy skills. The academic recognition of our work had led to federal grant opportunities that would allow us to expand our programs nationally, but more important, it had validated what we had learned through experience, that healing happened most effectively in community settings where people felt valued for their authentic selves, rather than judged for their inability to meet external expectations. The empty stocking that was supposed to teach Emma about inadequacy had instead taught hundreds of children that their worth was not determined by other people's approval or disapproval. That evening, as Emma and I drove home from the conference, she asked me whether I ever regretted the decision to distance ourselves from my parents and the extended family members who had supported my mother's treatment of her. The question surprised me, not because I hadn't thought about it, but because Emma had never before expressed any curiosity about maintaining connections with people who had demonstrated their willingness to harm her for the sake of family politics and traditional hierarchy. I explained to Emma that I had never regretted protecting her from continued exposure to toxic relationships, but I had sometimes wondered whether there might have been ways to maintain limited contact while still establishing firm boundaries about acceptable behavior. The difference, I told her, was that my parents had never acknowledged the harm they had caused or expressed any genuine interest in changing their approach to family relationships. They had continued to view my boundaries as temporary rebellion rather than permanent adjustments, based on their unwillingness to treat my daughter with basic respect and kindness. Emma's response demonstrated the emotional intelligence and wisdom she had developed through her work with other children facing similar challenges. She explained that she had learned to distinguish between relationships that were worth repairing and those that were fundamentally incompatible with her values and well-being. Some family connections could be healed through honest communication and mutual commitment to change, but others needed to be ended when they consistently caused harm to innocent people who deserved protection rather than exposure to ongoing dysfunction. The conversation reminded me of how much Emma had grown from the scared 8-year-old who had questioned her own worthiness into a confident teenager who understood that love was demonstrated through actions rather than proclaimed through words. She had learned to recognize emotional manipulation and respond to it with clarity rather than compliance, and she had developed the courage to advocate for herself and others when faced with unfair treatment or unreasonable expectations. The Christmas that followed Emma's conference presentation was our 6th annual celebration of choosing community over obligation, generosity over compliance, and authentic relationships over traditional family structures that prioritized hierarchy over mutual respect. Our holiday gathering filled the community center with families we had served, volunteers who had contributed to our programs, and community partners who had helped expand our impact throughout the region.
The event had evolved into a festival that celebrated resilience, healing, and the creation of chosen families that honored each person's inherent worth. Emma presented that year's Community Service Awards to recipients who embodied the values our programs were designed to promote, including a teenager who had organized support groups for children dealing with family trauma, a business owner who had created job training programs for single parents, and an elderly volunteer who had developed mentorship initiatives that connected isolated seniors with young people who needed additional sources of guidance and encouragement. The final award went to Miss Rodriguez, whose son Carlos had been one of our first Christmas recipients 5 years earlier, and who had since become a peer advocate helping other children navigate family difficulty. Carlos, now 13, like Emma, had developed a program that taught younger children how to recognize healthy versus unhealthy relationship patterns while building connections with trusted adults who could provide support during challenging times. Watching Carlos and Emma work together to coordinate youth advocacy programs had provided me with daily reminders of how much positive change was possible when children were supported by communities that valued their perspectives and invested in their development. The empty stocking that was intended to diminish Emma's sense of worth had instead sparked a movement that was empowering dozens of young people to become leaders and advocates within their own communities. The legacy we had built together extended far beyond the specific families we had served or the recognition we had received for our innovative approaches to community development. We had demonstrated that ordinary people could create extraordinary change when they chose to channel personal pain into collective healing, and we had proven that authentic relationships based on mutual respect were more valuable than traditional family connections that demanded compliance with destructive patterns and harmful expectations. As I watched Emma and her friends planning next year's community service initiatives, I realized that the greatest gift my mother had inadvertently given us was the clarity to see the difference between real love and conditional approval. The woman who thought she was teaching a lesson about worthiness had instead sparked a revolution that would continue long after Emma had grown up and moved on to create her own version of chosen family based on the values we had discovered together through our commitment to serving others. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them.